it is a way for certain officials and commanders to stir up controversy to make sure that the public will defend them from, in that instance, it was the Ministry of Defense and the Russian General Staff.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Jabot. And this time we're talking to analyst Kateryna Stepanenko from the Institute for the Study of War. Kateryna is the Russia deputy team lead and has produced daily assessments of the Russian offensive since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. She also carries out extensive research on the Russian information space and the Kremlin. Kateryna, welcome to Frontline. Good to see you again. Thank you very much. This is a critical time for foreign aid for Ukraine. Republicans in the US Senate have just voted against a fresh spending package for Kyiv. That's in spite of warnings from President Biden that US funding for Ukraine would run out by the end of the year. I'm just wondering, although the front lines are not moving much right now, is the war at a critical juncture?
So currently the war is at a phase that we call the positional warfare phase, meaning that neither of the sides is making significant progress, but both of the sides is in need of a technological development to advance their front lines. So for Ukraine, that is likely going to be F-16s, additional minesweeping equipment, additional air defense systems, air superiority via drones. All of these components is something that can help Ukraine break out of this positional warfare and restart its maneuver warfare that we saw last year in Kharkiv and Kherson. Weather also plays a significant role right now. There's not much we can see based on Russian nature of offensive operations around Luhansk Oblast as well as in southern Donetsk Oblast. Russians are also not making significant progress due to the implications that weather might have until the ground freezes. So all this to say is that Ukraine is in need of something that will break the technological parity that is currently ongoing on the battlefield, which can materialize in form of additional military aid to Ukraine.
And what impact do you think it will have, the stalling of that US aid? Because if you take the quotes of the US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, he cautioned that failure to approve it would let Putin prevail.
Of course, any type of stalling of military aid to Ukraine will help Russia to not only prolong the war, but improve their defense industrial base, mobilize additional men through crypto mobilization schemes and volunteer recruitment, but also form additional defense lines that have proven to be extremely successful during this counteroffensive in repelling Ukrainian counterattacks.
As we approach the end of the year and advances on the battlefield in Ukraine slow, how is President Putin preparing both for his re-election and to extend his power at home and his influence overseas?
Yeah, so Putin he has been preparing for the presidential election since before the beginning of the counteroffensive. It is likely that he established some sort of a goal of using the counteroffensive and making Russia fight and counterattack consistently in the counteroffensive to present Russia as a victor in this time frame, which had helped him to solidify a narrative in the information space that was previously very broken. So currently, Putin is preparing by trying to launch this offensive operation in Avdiivka. So any type of success that they can make in Avdiivka is obviously a pretty good informational effect for his constituencies, especially the ultranationalists that still support this war. But also Putin kind of adopted a rhetoric where he doesn't talk much about the war, but he still yet makes a lot of military-related appearances. So, for example, frequently visiting the Southern Military District headquarters in Rostov-on-Don, which was previously the headquarters that were surrounded by Wagner forces during the summer mutiny. So he's kind of playing this war leader. He is trying to pretend that he's a war leader to appeal to his ultranationals that still support the war, while also kind of maintaining a relatively distant narrative regarding the prospects of the war or the goals of this military the goals of this war. So he's playing both narratives to appeal to two different types of constituencies in Russia.
In the UK, a UK Foreign Office Minister, Leo Doherty, has accused Russia of hacking private conversations of high-profile politicians and civil servants in Britain. He believes this to be part of a concerted effort to undermine the UK ahead of its general election next year. How do you think Russia might use that kind of information? How does it try to exert its influence in these kind of nefarious ways overseas?
Russia has historically been really good at conducting information operations, cyber attacks, and that is a technique that they're not going to back down from. We know from also, I believe, British officials who had indicated that I believe only half of all legal spies, meaning the diplomats who are also spying for the Russian government in Europe, have left as of 2022. So there's still a significant chunk of Russians that are operating um, on the legal basis as diplomats in Europe who are using their position um, to infiltrate into European information spaces as well as security spaces. So I think that Russia has a pretty well developed network of agents across the world that are helping to facilitate these undertakings. And of course, anytime that there's an election, Russia sees that as an opportunity for weakness to spike up specific narratives that create social distrust towards politicians or create tensions and controversies among different marginalized groups. This is something that Russia has been very good at, regardless of the recent undertakings by Western governments to restrict the access to Russian media, for example.
We've already seen meetings with the Chinese president, the North Korean leader, visits to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and a visit by the president of Iran. What is the strategy here in terms of Putin building contacts with his allies? Is it a unifying cause, or are there separate interests for each one of these particular relationships?
I think Putin is definitely trying to unify the leaders that he thinks are ostracized by the Western world. He's trying to set up a new quote unquote world order, the way that he has been saying so in his speeches for years upon years. So I think that's what we're seeing. And so what is important to remember that this is not just Russia. This is not just Russia's war. This is also a war of countries that also want to undermine the current world order and also are seeking to destroy the foundations of the international system as we know it.
Do you get any impression that he's getting traction, that he actually has credibility in this sphere from the leaders that he's been meeting?
I think it's definitely, he might think of himself as more influential than he actually is, specifically in the relationship with China. I believe in the recent meeting between Putin and Xi, we saw a relationship where Putin likely expected military support from China, but had not received that in such negotiations. And I think that Russia, in that sense, is more of a little brother to China than what an equal partner. So there's a dynamic that Putin really relies on these countries to so, for example, China and Iran to support its war effort in Ukraine, and by de facto doesn't make themselves as equal to those countries.
There were reports this week that Qatar has helped secure the return of 6 kidnapped children to Ukraine. That's not a lot if you actually consider how many have been deported from Ukraine, some estimated 20,000 or so. Why would Vladimir Putin let, in this situation, these 6 children go?
We have been seeing a lot of exchanges and also return of a lot of Ukrainian deported children throughout a couple of months now. I think it's likely so that Russia can keep up an informational facade. A lot of officials who have been affiliated with children's deportations from Ukraine, from occupied Ukraine, have been putting up a front saying that these children were not actually deported. They were sent to Russia for either medical treatment or because the front lines were collapsing and children were in danger. We have all intent to return them. So I think this is part of the information technique for Putin to show that no, that this was not a deliberate act of genocide. This was not a deliberate violation of war code. This is something that the Kremlin did not actually intend to do. But in reality, we have seen a deliberate scheme go on between Russia and Belarus to deport Ukrainian children.
But who exactly is he trying to persuade of that fact?
I think it's probably the international community, but most importantly, it is the domestic the domestic community in Russia that does not want to. I don't know how to explain this. I do.
Is he placating people back home? Is it more so than actually believing that anyone on the international stage will actually believe this? This is a good guy deep
I
down.
mean, we do see the effects in the international space. We do see certain countries giving kind of not following the ICC's order. So to give Putin the opportunity, or Putin's Putin's actors to participate in certain international meetings. So there is an international factor to this. It is a significant factor because not everyone believes that Putin committed these crimes, and I think that that's kind of the facade that he's trying to keep up among other countries that are not per se Western countries.
There's a growing voice within Russia calling for an end to the war, for negotiations by the mothers and the wives of soldiers, this pressure group, if you like. What kind of impact do you think they're having?
I don't think they're having too much of an impact. I think that they are effective in deterring Putin from calling another mobilization, especially ahead of his elections. And I think they're effective in making sure that Russian conscripts, so the biannual conscription that happens in Russia, semi-annual conscription that happens in Russia for involuntary military service, that these conscripts do not participate in combat as well. So I think that is what is effective. He is aware that domestically, any type of mobilization or use of conscripts in combat is not going to be effective. However, in terms of deterring Putin from completing his maximalist goals, which are complete capture of Ukraine and demilitarization, which is stripping away Ukraine of its right to defend itself, of its ability to defend itself, is not something that can be swayed by public perception, at least in the near term.
So, irrespective of what this group of women are saying, do you think that, broadly speaking, that the Russian public is still behind the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, recent surveys by Levada Center, as well as other Russian independent polling services, indicate that most Russians still do support the course of the war, but also the objectives behind the war and the narratives behind the war, such as that the West had started this, that the West is the responsible party, that this is our time to avenge the West for all of the things that they've done to us before, but also to make sure that Ukraine is denazified, quote unquote.
Can you just explain a bit, Kateryna, how Putin has changed the narrative on the reason for this military operation since the start of the full-scale invasion?
Yeah, I think at the beginning of the war, the main emphasis was that there was a small amount of Ukrainians that are really against Russia, that are holding captive the rest of the country. And then gradually that vilification of Ukrainian people expanded to this being not just small assault groups within the Ukrainian military that are going against Russian-speaking population, to it being the entire government, but also the entire military. So it has kind of expanded to encompass more of Ukrainians than before. I think otherwise, a lot of Putin's rhetoric still stays the same. His recent speech at the World Russian Council was kind of a copy and paste of his ultimatum to Ukraine that he published in July of 2021, called "On Historic Unity of Russians and Belarusians and Ukrainians." And in that essay, he had underlined exact same topic of why Ukraine should not exist as a nation, that Ukraine is just part of the larger Russian nation alongside with Belarusians. So I wouldn't say that Putin's rhetoric and Putin's mindset had changed a lot since the start of the war. And I think the more victories that he sees, and for him, a victory was stalling the Ukrainian counteroffensive, the more likely he's going to continue to see this worldview, to follow this ideology that he had established around Ukraine.
And this address that you mentioned, the World Russian People's Council, where he gave this view or repeated it, as you say, of the Russian world. Can you just explain what it tells us about his ambitions beyond Ukraine?
Well, he definitely wants to also annex Belarus, as we can see. He has been de facto doing annexation of Belarus for over 20 years at this point, by integrating Belarus into what is called the Union State. The Union State network, the Union State structure is effectively a way to merge economic, military, social policies with Russia and Belarus, and it creates Belarus as its kind of own kind of Russian gubernia under the Moscow rule. So it really shows that not only does Putin think that Ukraine shouldn't exist as its own state, as its own nation, but he's also pursuing similar objectives for Belarus that are a little bit that are not necessarily military, but it is happening on a legal level at an alarmingly faster rate than it has been done so before. We're also seeing his worldview regarding all of the other ethnicities and all of the other nationalities that live in Russia. So for him, the Russian ethnic group is Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians. And then everyone else composes his Russian world, so Ruski Mir, which means kind of the extended Russian universe. So he essentially argued that the ethnos of the country, the Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, are what is holding the Ruski Mir. So without this ethnic group, there's not going to be any other ethnic groups in Russia, and there's not going to be Russia as state. So that is a notable ideological sentiment of his that shows how Russia legally views different types of ethnicities in its legal structure.
And beyond the ambition to annex Belarus, which you mentioned, does it go any further, or does it stop there for President Putin?
It's likely going to go further. I mean, we know that Putin had historically said that any country that was part of the Russian Empire or part of the Soviet Union is technically Russian land, and that it's united with Russia through a common story and a common history. So that can affect Moldova, which we frequently see a lot of Russian activity there, namely in an effort to destabilize the Moldovan government. We also see Russia looking at the Baltic states. So, for example, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland is a significant actor in this. So, no, Putin's ambitions don't just stop at Ukraine and Belarus. He has always had a forward thinking in terms of restoring the Russian Empire and pursuing his kind of imperialist objectives.
And just in terms of propagating Putin's worldview, how much influence and also his ability or desires to undermine other democracies, how much influence do you think the Kremlin is able to exert over foreign media reporting on the war in Ukraine?
The Kremlin exerts a lot of influence over foreign media. And we see that by the Kremlin sometimes takes one of the probably not very important officials and makes them say something really ridiculous regarding, for example, nuclear weapons or regarding, I don't know, something that Russian technically mobilization reserve has 25 million personnel. And those statements, even though we have been fighting against Russian disinformation campaigns, those statements still make it into the media and get amplified and get proliferated throughout different policy worlds as well as different communities. And that kind of solidifies the Russian intended projection of power. So Russia takes what it has and expands it into informational power to make sure that policymakers worldwide are still perceiving Russia as a superpower with nuclear capabilities, with extensive navy, with significant mobilization reserve, even if those factors are not fully true.
Dmitry Medvedev springs to mind there.
Right.
Yeah, I remember talking to an analyst about something recent he'd said about nuclear weapons and saber rattling and all that. He said, yeah, but it's him. We don't listen. Do you
Yeah.
actually think these kind of things actually do have any impact?
I think so. Yeah, it solidifies an idea that is common among certain groups of policymakers about the perceived the idea that the West can never uh, go against Russia, that the West can never outproduce Russia. For example, this is a significant narrative in military production. I've noticed a lot of discussions of, well, Russia can produce 2 million shells per year. We cannot produce nearly as much. Well, Russia is in a worse standing. It's in a war footing, so its defense industrial base is working 24/7 and is not necessarily comparable to what we're seeing on the ground, where most Western countries are still, operating their defense industrial base to support peacetime production, not in an effort to support wartime production. So it is kind of, it does affect the way that we think about Russia, because it makes it seem a lot more indefeatable than we might actually, than that it is actually on the battlefield.
It must be very difficult to actually establish the reality then behind all of this.
Of course, it's a long history of Russian projection of power, especially through all of these years of disinformation campaigns. They simply just don't go away. They do have a permanent impact on the way that we perceive Russia and its threat.
You follow what Russian military bloggers are saying very closely. Who do you look at, and what are they saying? I mean, can they give you more of an insight into what's really happening?
Yeah, we follow a tremendous amount of Russian military bloggers, so I probably won't be able to list many. We've developed a strategy in which we profile different types of opinions, right? So some military bloggers are purely purely talk about what is going on a particular front line. For example, Zaporizhia frontline, because they talk to personnel on the ground, or there are actually some volunteer battalions that maintain their own blog of their own operations. But we also have some military bloggers that are directly affiliated with the Kremlin, who oftentimes reiterate some of Kremlin's information operations, that then we can kind of use whatever the discussion that they're using, and use the discussions that they are producing to trace back to the original root of the information campaign from the Kremlin. We also have certain military bloggers that are directly tied to veteran organizations. So those are individuals that are very critical of the way that the Russian Ministry of Defense is not conducting reforms and mobilization that it needs to win. That Russian military essentially has an effective structure in place for mobilization, and that it has the capacity of using its mobilization reserve, but they're not using it in favor of a crypto mobilization campaign to save the regime. So there's a lot of narratives that are ongoing. I also want to preface that a lot of military bloggers act as voices for certain officials or even military commanders. There's a significant portion of military bloggers that promote commanders, such as, for example, Airborne Forces Commander Mikhail Teplinsky, and they kind of launch these very favorable profiles of these commanders in an effort to trigger command changes. And we have seen that in the past to be very effective, especially, again, with the reappointment of Teplinsky as the airborne commander last year. So that actually, I think, sorry, it was this year. But yeah, so the military bloggers is kind of this community of people that is not necessarily just individuals. A lot of them have networks and organizations behind them pushing a specific objective, so that with the ultimate goal of making it heard to Putin via his constituencies, and so that Putin then will decide to undertake a particular change. And we have seen that to be pretty effective.
So how much power do they actually wield?
Some of them do have a lot, especially if they're successful in creating controversy. They can have pretty good implications. I think the
Can you give me an example, for example?
Yes, of course. An example of this would be last year, there were rumors emerging about Mikhail Teplinsky, the airborne commander, having a fight with Gerasimov, and that Gerasimov fired him or that Teplinsky resigned. It was either or. And then later on, Mikhail Teplinsky released a video of himself. I think it was a month after the Battle of Solidar in around Bakhmut, and in which he had vaguely implied that the reason why he had left his command was because other generals were committing Russians to pointless battles and that many Russians were dying. And that video got amplified through the Russian information space. And then later on, the veteran communities also wrote a letter in support of Teplinsky's to Putin, and that had a communal effect where in March, Teplinsky was reappointed. And then Putin also made a very public appearance with Teplinsky in the same place in Kherson Oblast. So it's kind of this spiral. And later on, I think we also saw similar campaigns to retain Teplinsky in power. Over the summer, after Prigozhin, Wagner financier Yevgeny Prigozhin's mutiny, a lot of Teplinsky's channels, who were technically affiliated with Wagner at one point, they started to put out videos of servicemen of airborne forces saying that they would withdraw from the lines if Teplinsky was removed as part of the purge, the command purge that was going on. And there were several commanders that were effectively removed that summer. Teplinsky was not one of them. So it is a way for certain officials and commanders to stir up controversy to make sure that the public will defend them from, in that instance, it was the Ministry of Defense and the Russian General Staff.
Since you mentioned that the stirring up of controversies, I'm just wanted to talk a little bit about the controversy at the moment, the rumours of this split divisions on the Ukrainian side between President Zelensky and the rumours of this commander-in-chief Zaluzhny, that there is a divide emerging there. How much Russian influence would there be in spreading that narrative, and would the Russian military bloggers just be limited to commenting on Russian things, or will they be trying to influence that narrative as well?
This is a very, very big narrative among Russian military bloggers that does seep through Ukrainian Telegram channels and does then later on make it into public discussion on Ukrainian state television, and then effectively make it into Western media, Western discussions. Whether there is any conflict between Zaluzhny and Zelensky, that is something that we will not know because it is behind closed doors, but also it is kind of anticipated. I mean, any normal country that has a divided military and political leadership is bound to disagree in certain things, especially during a turbulent time, especially after the counteroffensive did not give us the results that we have been expecting. That is perfectly normal. What is not normal is the way that Russia does things, which is if a particular commander does not satisfy Putin's maximalist goal of capturing all of Ukraine, they get removed and they get silenced. And then we see Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Gerasimov essentially try to promise to Putin these unachievable victories on the battlefield. But in terms of military bloggers, yeah, this has been a narrative among military bloggers since the start of this war. This is something that they consistently talk about.
And if you say you should take this with a huge pinch of salt, this idea there are divisions between President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny. Also, this other narrative that's been going around saying that Zelensky is cutting him out of decision making and he's going directly to some commanders on the ground. That also presumably there's no evidence of that from your research.
This is not something that we necessarily focus on, so I'm not probably the best person to speak about the internal Ukrainian dynamics, since the purpose of ISW is to really analyze the Russian activities and how they do things. But based on the information space in Russia, this has been the number one narrative that has been going around for over 2 years now. even before the war started, there were a lot of rumors that the military leadership was disagreeing with Zelensky, and that that the military is not going to support the government, essentially. And ultimately, all of these rumors did not materialize. We still have Zelensky and Zaluzhny make public appearances, but beyond that, this is a very effective narrative for Russians, because it does trigger a sense of fear among Ukrainians. And that is the purpose of conducting these information and psychological operations, is to cause Ukrainians to not feel as nearly as confident as they were at the beginning of the war about repelling Russian aggression and repelling Russian attacks. So the Russians also are doing similar thing with discussions and narratives about Ukrainian mobilization. So there's meal bloggers consistently repost videos and claims of, Ukrainian officials trying to expand mobilization, or rumors about how Ukrainian police is going around different houses and taking men and making them mobilized, and so on and so on. So it is effective because it does create fear. And that is something that we see often, especially on Telegram channels.
A recent an interview in the Times newspaper was Sunday Times newspaper was talking about the re-emergence or the activation of Russian sleeper agents in Ukraine. What do you know about that, and what could they do, or would they be tasked to do?
I think a lot of the sleeper agents have been operating as a network of collaborators. So they're looking for Ukrainian military infrastructure so that Russians can target it with either their Iranian made or even domestically made Shahed drones, as well as with their missiles. We obviously have seen what previous intelligence leaks have done, namely with the aftermath of the Russian strike, Iskander strike, on a Ukrainian unit stationed near Zaporizhia. I believe it was the 128th Ukrainian brigade that was conducting an award ceremony, and Russians used a ballistic Iskander missile to strike the ceremony, resulting in significant losses among Ukrainian personnel. So I think the objective of this collaborative network primarily is going to focus on looking for any type of information on Ukrainian infrastructure to maximize the effectiveness of Russian strikes, which have not been very effective last year because they were primarily targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure with the intent of making Ukrainians so not happy with their living conditions that they revolt against the government, that they protest and kind of cause the capitulation of the government themselves, rather than having Russia go to Kiev.
And beyond Ukraine itself, how has Russia sought to create division between Ukraine and its Eastern European neighbors?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the summer, we at ISW predicted that Russia is going to continuously strike Ukrainian port infrastructure, so that the grain deal is significantly impacted, meaning that Ukrainians cannot export their own grain and other produce that they produce via maritime trade, and instead would have to export into European countries, which had caused several protests and also resistance from Central and Eastern European countries. This is something that Russia is doing to trigger the divide and also influence the opinions of these countries about Ukraine and supporting Ukraine. So there were a couple of prominent statements recently from Andrei Duda, for example, that he later on recalled regarding, providing Ukraine with Western military aid. He later clarified that that's not necessarily what he meant. However, those are all methods by which Russia creates these economic issues. And we know that the Russians used to do this with gas, especially using gas crises to, affect the economy, and in turn get the hybrid warfare objective that they've intended to do, to break up the Western Union, for example. So that's kind of what we're seeing here, is that the effect of Russians destroying Ukrainian farm infrastructure as well as port infrastructure is something that is going to affect and strain those relationships.
I mean, Russia accused of using trade, and you talk about the energy there, but elsewhere, also people, more specifically migration to stoke unrest in places like Finland. What evidence do you have of that, and why are they doing it?
Yeah, so Finland right now is facing a migrant crisis on its border. It's not a significant crisis, however, in comparison to what we saw at the Belarusian Polish border in 2021 in the lead up to the war. So that is an example that we often use in terms of analyzing, Kremlin proxy operations. The migrant crisis primarily intends to create information operations that make the West worry about their own homes rather than focus on Ukraine. There's a slew of news about the border, and Russia is really playing a game in this. I often look at Kremlin wires, and Finland is probably the number one story almost every single day. That is getting promoted and amplified through different channels, and then it goes to Ukrainian channels, and it is all a vacuum. The idea for this is to create enough worry internally, and by defact distract from Ukraine, distract from Russia, distract from problems on the battlefield, for example, and make people and policymakers focus on what is going on and how should they defend their own homes.
And also, I suppose, no surprise that the message might also be sort of subtly in there saying, and look what happens to new NATO members.
Right, of course.
As a Ukrainian working in Washington, D.C., have you had the opportunity, just anecdotally to finish with, to communicate with Russians who've left the Russian Federation since the full-scale invasion? And if so, what is their perspective on the war? What do they say to you as a Ukrainian national?
Yeah, I've interacted with several of my professors who have fled Russia. Some of them even talked about how, I believe one of them had left the week that Russia declared mobilization, and so he had went through one of the northern borders to leave Russia. The overarching sentiment is, of course, apologetic. The people are apologetic for what they have done to, what their government has done to Ukraine. So I have pretty good relationships with some of the individuals that had left. But it is it's a very small group of people that I have spoken to. I think I have a little bit more negative conversations with a lot of Russians that have been living in the U.S. for a long period of time, namely because of the effectiveness of Russian propaganda. A lot of them do think that the war is justified. Some of my neighbors perhaps actually have stated that that Putin is not doing anything wrong, and that is because we had Russian state television in the U.S. for a very long time until 2022, and that has its own effects, and also that kind of cultural ties to Russia still persist no matter where you are. So.
Do you try and tell those people what you know, and to help them see through any propaganda they'd be receiving and perhaps gobbling up without question?
I have been trying to do so since 2014, but unfortunately it's very challenging, and that's probably not a very productive time at this point, because it's something that is not going to change unless the idea of Putin, as this macho man is destroyed, that until Putin is defeated decisively on the battlefield and until Ukraine gets to restore its territories.
Kateryna Stepanenko, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio or go to thetimes.co.uk. My thanks to our producer, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye-bye for now.